am here with some very prominent museum directors, 3 white guys, as Glenn just pointed out to me, to talk about the future of art museums. Each of you is currently in the midst of a high-cost, multi-year renovation and/or expansion of your facilities. Can you briefly take us through the chief underlying need that is driving each of these projects and sort of why this is needed to position your institution for the future? And I'll throw it to you, Glenn, first.
Thank you, Hilarie. So our project is both an expansion of about 50,000 square feet of new gallery space and about 100,000 square feet of renovation in order to link the 2 projects together. And it's driven by 3 primary goals. The first is to create more space and some different spaces to show our collection. This is not about adding space for temporary exhibitions as much as it is about expanding the space to show our collection, which is large and which we obviously want to show to the fullest possible degree we can. It also involves creating some new kinds of spaces, like a studio for performance, which we don't currently have. The second driver, beyond more space to show the collection in new and different ways, is to create a more welcoming engagement for our visitors, to transform the experience of moving through the museum into something that's much more pleasant and socially engaged. We recognize that people who come to museums today not only want to move from the entrance to a work of art, but they want to have time to stop and think and pause and talk, relax and refresh. So the whole movement through the museum has been reconsidered in order to make that more engaging. And then the third dimension is to connect the museum even more deeply to Midtown Manhattan. We were created as one of the first street institutions. If you think about historic museums, they are generally set in a park. Often you ascend a flight of steps, this notion of leaving the street for high culture. When we were built in the 1930s, the idea was that the museum engaged the street, that there was no separation from the energy of Midtown Manhattan and what was taking place in the museum. And so this renovation and expansion endeavors to open up the museum even more extensively to that energy and that presence of the vibrancy of Midtown Manhattan.
Right. Gary, you got a lot more space than...
Yeah, no, it's interesting how similar our project is to Glenn's and to the Museum of Modern Art, but there were sort of different motivations. We too were building a 160,000 square foot building designed by Stephen Hall and Chris McVoy for modern and contemporary art, really art of the last century. So from about World War I, 1914 until the present. It will have many of the features that Glenn just described of MoMA, but it will be primarily for our permanent collection. We were not building extra special exhibition space. We're not hiring new curators. We will have different kinds of spaces than we've had in the past. But our motivation, which sets us apart, is that in 2004, one of our benefactors left us an enormous fortune to buy modern and contemporary art. And so now for 10 years, we've been buying a lot of modern and contemporary art and had no place to put it. Right. And so the need for a new building was simply to house what will be in perpetuity an enormous endowment to acquire new works of art.
Right. So Markus, they're not making new ancient art. So what's driving your...
Well, basically, when we look at the Pergamon Museum and Museum Island, we have to go back in history because what's going on at the Pergamon Museum right now is still, if you will, some kind of consequence of the reunification and what came afterwards, because the museums east and west were reunited, and there is a master plan Museum Island that was established in 1999, and that was the basis for the recognition of Museum Island as World Heritage of UNESCO. And the Pergamon Museum is the last big project on Museum Island to be completed. The Pergamon Museum, as you all know, was opened in 1930, has never undergone reconstruction or substantial reconstruction. So it's very much about 3 things for us as well. One is getting the building up to date, create a modern infrastructure for a museum. The second task, of course, is to get the exhibit up to date, because what we're seeing now is basically still the exhibit of the 1930s, slightly modified in the 1950s, but that is not necessarily what audiences want to see today. At the same time, the building and the exhibit is protected to some degree. So we have to negotiate between keeping the old, creating a museum inside the museum, and at the same time make the museum more inclusive and more accessible to today's audiences. And then the big question, of course, for us is, once it's finished, it'll be maybe 2030. What kind of museum do we want in 2030? This is a huge challenge also technologically speaking, because when we talk about digital media in the museum, what kinds of digital media will we have in 2030, 35? Will we still be using smartphones or something else? So this is one of the big challenges for us right now, because we need to design them now.
Well, so how do you think about designing for something that far out, and with digital media that you don't know what it's going to be?
I think what you have to do is you have to stop thinking about the technology and start thinking about the content. Because obviously when you use digital media, when you have different kinds of formats, you also need different kinds of contents. When you start telling stories on social media, you need different kinds of stories. And you have different formats for telling these stories. And obviously the curator's discourse, the discourse that we've been having in the museum for the last 100 to 150 years is not necessarily something that lends itself to digital media. So one of the biggest tasks right now within the framework of the digital transformation is to create content that can be used in digital media independently of the actual kind of technology that we are using right now and that we will be using. And don't forget that right now we still don't know what kind of digital media and how many digital media we want in a museum. We're still experimenting. We're still trying to figure out what to use and to what degree, because we want to draw more audiences into the museum, but we don't want to distract them from the objects.
But what does that really look like? Can you give us an example of how you're thinking about that kind of content, with your permanent collection?
I think let's look at a very simple example: the Ishtar Gate at the Pergamon Museum, which is part of my collection. Right now, when you look at the Ishtar Gate, you get some basic information on the history of architecture, on the historical context. But of course, there is also another story to tell, which is how the Ishtar Gate or the fragments were brought to Berlin. And I think what you need to do is to include that kind of story in your exhibit. When you have an analog space, there is only so much you can tell. Digital media allow you to include more information and to target that information to specific target groups. At the same time, when we talk about a participatory museum, a more inclusive museum, we have to try to include the stories of the visitors, of the audiences within the exhibit. So we need to try to find formats or technologies that will allow us to interact with our audiences. That could be a Tinder app for objects, for example. It could also be a visitor guide that allows you to interact with other people in the room and to share, why not? And to exchange comments, and also to store the stories of the people from Iraq and Syria, because they have stories to tell as well that may very well be different from the stories that curators tell.
I would just add that I think it's more than just content. I think the real issue for all of us in the museum world is to learn to think digitally, so that what we're talking about is not simply the transformation of certain kinds of stories into different formats or the use of new technologies to deliver those stories, but to fundamentally rethink how we think, to move away from the kind of analog art history that we were all taught, hierarchical, sequential, to a more networked, reconsidered manner of actually presenting works of art, so that we begin to move into a realm where the way in which we look at art, the way in which we display art, actually is no longer so analog. And I think one of the great advents of digital technology is that it has begun to teach us how to imagine different relationships between objects and between viewers and objects. And technology is simply the glue or the conduit by which those relationships can be developed. But we have to actually start thinking about the kinds of exhibitions we're doing in new and different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with Glenn. I mean, that's just absolutely what's going on these days. And if you look at what the Met Breuer is doing, for example, is these mashups of 500 years and drawing very interesting conclusions. If you look at how Instagram and Pinterest is organizing itself, that tells us how the modern mind is working in the digital mode, as Glenn would say, and it gives us keys for how we can present the art. I think there's, and I'm a classical art historian, there's nothing more boring than art history. And I was taking someone...
Wait a minute!
No, I'm sorry. I was taking someone through, someone from the Middle East through our galleries of European painting in Houston, and we have a really very choice collection of old master painting from early Renaissance until the early 20th century on view right now. And as I was showing our highlights and our masterpieces and telling the story of European painting to someone who was not familiar with this story, but who is an art aficionado in other worlds, I realized what an inside baseball and insular story this was, and how, in fact, I wasn't showing in our galleries European culture. I was showing a very linear story of European paintings. This begat that. It was kind of biblical genealogy. And it's wrong. We need to show, for example, in those galleries, European culture, and mix it up and make it vibrant and exciting. And so that's what we're going to be doing with our 20th century building as well, mixing decorative arts and jewelry and pieces of architecture and photographs with great paintings by Pollock and Rothko and others.
Right. So for the institutions dealing with contemporary art especially, I mean, won't there always be the pressure of new art running out of space? How big can you grow while still maintaining a visitor experience that feels manageable and comfortable?
Depends on your storage facility.
Oh, I was going to say, how about the size of Manhattan? I mean, you want to think big. No, I actually think that the challenge becomes less how big can you grow, but how well can you tell different stories. And we've gotten used to the idea that when we talk about the collection, we talk about something that's permanent, that doesn't change. Whereas what we have to think about is the collection as a living organism that's changing all the time. So it might be frustrating for some to come to the Museum of Modern Art and not see one of our great Jackson Pollocks or not see Matisse's Dance, things that, today would seem difficult. But we want people to come and see Faith Ringgold's Die and a whole range of works that they might be unfamiliar with. And to a very large degree, I think our responsibility has as much to do with ensuring that iconic works are present as it is to ensuring that the unfamiliar is made accessible. And the only way to make that manageable is to think about the collection as constantly changing, even more than our temporary exhibition program changes. It will take some getting used to, but I think the quality of experience, which has to do with scale and intimacy and organization, has to ultimately be sufficiently powerful that the fact that you can't see everything is secondary.
Yeah, but this is going to take very skilled curators to mount these displays because you can have great ideas, but then you have to make it work with physical objects that may not want to play well together. And so it is going to be, I think this kind of installation is going to be much more challenging than the linear installations to which we're in the sort of classifications that we're accustomed to in the past.
Right. I mean, you're going to have 3 very large buildings, lots of tunnels and beautiful grounds.
Yeah, right.
How is a visitor going to be able to manage all that?
Well, we don't expect, just like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we're not going to expect anyone to see everything in our 3 buildings in our 14-acre campus all at once. We expect that people will select an experience. Would they like to see non-Western art? Would they like to see European art from the last 500 years? Would they like to see modern and contemporary art? Do they want to go to our outdoor amphitheater, our new plaza, play in the fountain, go to the sculpture garden? So there'll be many experiences for people to have. But one thing, too, we also have an urbanistic ambition, much like Glenn's, although we can actually reshape our physical environment more easily than one can in Manhattan. And so we're turning Midtown Houston into a pedestrian town, which it was designed to be 100 years ago, stopped being, and is now slowly coming back. And we're an engine in that development of our local environment.
Mm-hmm. And there's a pedestrian aspect to the whole.
Absolutely. Well, not only to the Pergamon, but to Museum Island. And if you look beyond Museum Island, if you look at the Humboldt Forum that is just being erected as we speak right now, you'll understand that within the center of Berlin, there will be a cultural neighborhood. There will be something that you want to go to because this is where you can experience the history of the world. And if you want to use the term Universal Museum, this is actually where it is found, and I think this is one of the big challenges and also one of the chances for the city of Berlin and also for Germany to have this in the heart of the capital and to have people experience this alongside other cultural opportunities.
Right. So there's been a lot of discussion lately of admissions policies. How will you assure that your facilities are going to be financially sustainable?
Well, I think, first of all, most of us, I should say, at least Gary and I don't know the German system, we're lucky enough that we have considerable endowments that support our institutions. We're constantly in the process of trying to grow those endowments so that they pick up an ever greater part of what we do. We are, always struggling against the cost of what we do and the quality of what we want to do, right? There's a trade-off in that. And you can make the argument that most American museums are wildly undercapitalized. They don't ultimately have the resources to succeed except through effectively deficit financing, that is fundraising, right? That's what we do. We backfill the deficit with fundraising. And yet, almost all of us have found ways to ensure that there's free admission for large segments of the population, that there are days when there are free admission, that there are reduced prices for all sorts of different categories of admission. And I think we live in a world of trade-offs. There's a real dichotomy in the American museum world, I believe, between a handful of museums that have very significant resources and a much larger percentage of American museums that have far more constrained resources. And sooner or later, there's going to be a crisis. So, and I think we're all aware of it. We struggle individually to ensure that the crisis isn't going to affect our institution, but we're nationally aware of the fact that the American Museum as an institution is an undercapitalized institution.
Yeah, and we see that stress all the time, especially with smaller institutions, sometimes affiliated with a larger parent organization like a university museum or the Berkshire Art Museum. They have to sell works. They feel that they have to sell works of art in order to finance their everyday operation. So that pressure is we see, erupting constantly. Similarly, in Houston, we have a varied admission policy. Our longest day, Thursday, is our free day. About a third of all of our visitors come in for free one way or another. But the interesting thing is, and our admission fee is not quite as high as in New York. As in New York, it's $15. But right across the street, the Contemporary Art Museum is free, and just up the street 5 minutes is the Menil, and they're always free. But we get, say 5 times as many visitors as the Contemporary Art Museum, 3 times as many visitors as the Menil, and they're always free. And so I would say in my community, the price of admission is not an obstacle to visiting the museum, and especially since a third of the people come in for free in any event. But it is always this balance of whether it's a third of endowment, new fundraising, and earned income at the door, at the shop, in the restaurant. Each one of our American institutions has its own formula. European museums obviously have the benefit, for the most part, of state support, which they're constantly under pressure to augment with private philanthropy.
Yeah, so how does it compare?
Well, I think in Germany it's different for many reasons. In general, I would agree with you. If we look at the German museum, it's probably underfinanced as well because not all museums are public museums. Not all museums have substantial private funding. There are lots of small museums in cities that are in dire need of funding, especially when they want to expand, grow, be more modern. When you look at the state-financed institutions like the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation, I would say that we're very well equipped to function as a museum, as art museums. At the same time, we know that museums today fulfill many other functions, and there is a growing demand for the social role of the museum. There was a UNESCO recommendation in 2015 that stresses the social role of museums. So we're starting to develop more departments, we're getting new functions, we're trying to address societal challenges in Germany. For example, cultural integration, migration is a huge topic. Museums should play a vital part in that debate. And if we're supposed to do that, we do need more funding. And I think this has to come in part from the government. If the public sector wants us to be more active as cultural institutions, there has to be more money. And at the same time, of course, the fundraising culture in Germany is not as developed as it is in the United States, for example. And I think this is where we can learn from you, obviously, and this is also where we can grow considerably over the next years.
Right. There has been a broad shift in thinking about museums over the years. They were once more quiet, contemplative, temple-like places. Now people are looking for more dynamic social spaces. The latest Culture Track study in the US found that 81% of cultural consumers were most interested in having fun, which I understand sent something of a gasp around the museum world when it was presented last fall. How has this cultural shift informed your building plans, or how you think about your future mission?
Listen, I think that, first of all, there's golden age theory that always applies, that museums in the past were quiet places of repose. I'm not so sure that's as true as people would like to remember. But more importantly, the idea that museums are social spaces is self-evident in the construct. They are physical places where art and people come together, and they always have been. You don't go to a museum to be alone. You go to a museum to look at art in the presence of other people. And I think what many of us have realized is if you can activate that and transform that into a socially engaged experience that creates conversations within the institution and outside of it, the act of looking becomes even more exciting and engaging than as a purely solitary experience. I'm not saying for a moment that we shouldn't also provide opportunities for solitude for those who seek it, but I think one of the reasons we've seen our demographics change dramatically from an average age of a little over 50 to an average age of under 40 has been because we've recognized what people who are younger want to do when they go to a museum. They want to be with each other and talk and think and text and create a kind of continuum of experience. And so the idea, Markus called it participatory, the idea of a museum as a place of conversation that engages the ideas of the institution as much as the ideas of its visitors, means that you can activate it in new and different ways, which may be difficult for some of us who were trained in classical art history, but I find it liberating. I actually think that what's going on in museums today, when people go and realize that they can spend a half a day or a full day looking, talking, engaging, but that it's enjoyable. It doesn't have to be work. It doesn't have to be painful.
I just think we also have to be mindful of, our traditional, or you might call our base, our traditional audience as well, who may not want to have that same kind of exciting experience with other people and may want to have a contemplative experience. One little fact that I brought in my pocket today is that, each market is different, and each community has its own likes and dislikes. And one thing that stunned me in Houston, but it was a fact, we had 2 special exhibitions, very difficult to mount, one in succession after the other. A beautiful Mark Rothko exhibition with about 80, a full retrospective 80 works, primarily from the National Gallery in Washington, magnificent, followed by a Winterhalter exhibition. And Winterhalter pulled 50% more audience than Mark Rothko did in Houston, Texas, the home of the Rothko Chapel.
Right.
So, not every market is mature, not every market is jaded, not many, in Houston, we're having now a small Michelangelo and Raphael and Titian exhibition. People are thrilled to see that. They're not saying, ho-hum, please activate this for me. They're thrilled to have such distinguished works of art, iconic works of art in their midst. So at the same time, we do these huge immersive exhibitions. Our most popular was a Ron Mueck exhibition. And for that exhibition, we had, for the first time, an enormous audience of 18 and under. And we had 50% more 18 and under admissions during the Ron Mueck exhibition than we've ever had in the history of our museum. So when you hit the button correctly, you can draw this particular demographic, but then there are many of our audience who like Winterhalter as well.
I don't think it's a question of one or the other. I think it's a question of a continuum of experience, and that you obviously, all institutions want to embrace the largest possible public that they can. But I do think there is a shift in what people expect when they go to a museum. And I think the Culture Tracker report indicated that shift.
Yeah. I was going to comment on that because when you look at Culture Track, it also tells you what people consider to be a cultural experience. And that made me think, because a lot of people said going to a restaurant is a cultural experience. So we have to think of culture in a different way and also think differently about what people expect and how to attract audiences. We know in Berlin, for example, that lots of tourists come to experience the recent history of Berlin. What does that mean for an archaeological collection? It probably means you have to link your collection and your exhibit back to the recent history of Germany. So you have to very much pick up where people want to be picked up, and that changes over time. And we're seeing from Culture Track, for example, that expectations are different now than they used to be 20 years ago, and we have to react to that.
Right. Just think what you could do with virtual reality at the Ishtar Gate. I mean, that would be mind-blowing.
Or a great restaurant.
Yeah.
Just saying.
But yet, all culture is not the same thing. So, I mean, I want to throw it out to questions in a minute, but I mean, how better can museums also articulate the difference between looking at original artworks and other forms of entertainment?
Yeah, I don't know if that's for us to decide. I mean, obviously, we self-select and choose and edit by what we present, but I think it's really up for, I don't think there's any bad result. If it looks good, it is good. If the people are enjoying themselves and voting with their feet, then we're doing the right thing. And so basically you're asking a question about standards and the canon and propriety, and I think all of us are saying we're moving on and having a much wider point of view.
And I think the key is artists have moved on. Yeah. I mean, there used to be these categories: high art, fashion, commerce, you name it. And artists have just demolished that. They're absorbing whatever interests them and creating work out of that. And sometimes it means dealing with popular issues that might not fit that higher category. We just have to relax and understand that art is exactly what is being done today.
I want to throw it out to you. Go ahead. Oh.
The future of the museums take me to the Middle East, where I live actually, and I am very surprised what they are doing. I would like to know, independently of their political controversies, Qatar and UAE are making huge and enormous changes. What do you think if we take the Louvre, for example, in Saadiyat Island, in the different political internal changes that they are doing in terms of curatorial distributions or ideas? What do you think about those big changes?
You should hand the microphone to one of the great leaders in that world right here.
Yeah.
I think you've got this fantastic moment, particularly in the Gulf, where there are different models that are all being played out in exciting ways. You have institutions that have been created in Qatar, and they are extraordinary, both in terms of the quality of their collections, but also in their ambition. You have a very different model in Abu Dhabi, and yet another model in Sharjah. And now in Saudi Arabia, yet another model that's being created. And I think the reality is, of course, each responds to the needs of its own communities, but what I see is tremendous ambition, access to the resources that enable those ambitions to be realized, and the fact that in some instances, like the Louvre Abu Dhabi, it's the result of a partnership with an existing European institution, and in the case of Qatar, it's the acquisition of collections and programs largely done internally. It means that they're just different ways of getting at something. You can then step back and ask, what's the larger intellectual agenda of all of these institutions? And I think the jury is still out. They're being formed. The story hasn't been told. We're getting to witness the chapters as they're being written. That's how I look at it.
Maybe we can just do one quick question, one more.
In light of recent controversies like the Walker, the Whitney Museum, and for full disclosure, I work at the Whitney Museum, at the Guggenheim, etc. How do you see museums responding to the spectrum of different interests of groups who feel their cultures are being appropriated or feel a right to say what should be or shouldn't be on the walls of museums? Our museums, I feel they're moving into capitulating, acquiescing into these interests. Well, and this is mainly a question for Gary and for Glenn, because this is an American context, which is the one I know the best.
I can assure you we would prefer if Markus answered.
No, actually,
I want to be really clear.
I have something I want to say, which is that on the one hand, obviously, I think it's essential for us to be in constant communication, and there can never be enough communication with our community, and each of our communities is different. And at the Walker, we learned about sensitivities that everyone at the museum was almost completely unaware of. Now they know, but tomorrow there'll be another community whose toes will be stepped on, and then a new dialogue will happen, and there will be enlightenment that comes as a result. But the other part of your question I really want to attack, and that is that censorship is evil. And so that the notion that a marginalized group can dictate to another group what can be seen, that is no different, and we're here in Berlin, than book burning. Saying that this cannot exist, this must be destroyed, this must be put underground. We've seen that before, and it's evil.
Okay.
So at the risk of getting in trouble, I think underneath your question is a larger, more interesting problem. And it has to do, at least in the United States, with the anxiety that everyone feels post the election of the current president and government, where there is a sensitivity about that one's values are being marginalized or underappreciated. And what that has created, I think, is hypersensitivity. Rather than thinking more laterally and trying to embrace difference, everybody now feels threatened. And out of that threat comes, I think, often overreaction to issues and the inability to have a sustained conversation about what are the norms and what needs to be done.
Great. Thank you. We'll have to end there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And turning the stage over to Robin.